Welcome to the This Week in Clean Tech podcast, where each week we speak to a leading CEO, executive, thought leader, or insider in the clean tech sector. Each guest shares their thoughts on recent events, their own clean tech story, and their vision and hopes for the future. This week, our host David Hunt is joined by Emma Pinchbeck, Executive Director of the trade association RenewableUK. Previously, Emma was head of WWF-UK's climate change and energy programme and a commercial consultant in the energy sector. She's passionate about action on climate change and interested in how to make change happen, whether that's making the economy more sustainable or the workplace more diverse. Before we start, a reminder that you can subscribe to the This Week in Clean Tech via iTunes or all the other usual podcast platforms. And now, over to David. Hope you enjoy.
Good morning, Emma. Thanks very much for joining us this morning on the This Week in Clean Tech podcast.
You're very welcome.
So it's so much going on, and one of the challenges we have on the podcast is in a short time discussing what is a massive topic with so much going on. So we thought we'd highlight a few things from our discussion around some relevant news stories from the last week, certainly talking around innovations in both technology and business models in the renewable and clean tech sector, and then a little bit more about your work and your hopes for the future. And also one of the topics we've thought about, which again has been brought up a number of times recently for us, is around the future of work. And diversity and all that entails. So first and foremost, I know you've been incredibly busy, but any particular news stories or issues that have jumped?
The striking one from the last couple of weeks has to be that we've broken all wind generation records. And that's primarily because we've had terrible weather. And fortunately in this job, something really nice happens, which is that you can get out of bed on a sunny day in summer and feel really happy about the weather, but you can also get out of bed on a miserable day in winter and know that the wind fleet is probably doing all right. And last year we had wind keeping the lights on during the Beast from the East when we had issues with the gas supply. And this year we've just smashed through our generation records. So we were doing about a third of our electricity was coming from the wind fleet alone. And that's pretty spectacular. If you look forward to where the industry hopes to go, by 2030 we're looking to be doing a third of the electricity mix from just offshore wind alone. And I mean, projections vary, but you're talking about, I think, at least 60% of the electricity mix coming from renewables. The way that's it's likely to go up. And I think we're just beginning now to see what a system will look like when renewables are incumbent. And I think that's really fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. I think certainly I've been in the sector since 2007. I know you've been around for probably longer than that, but to look at those numbers 10 years ago, we would have been laughed at, and now I should say A, they've been achieved, and B, those records won't stand for much longer, I'm quite sure.
Yeah, we actually, there's an ongoing debate in the office about whether we ever do a press release when we break another record, because there was a point last winter, I think, where we broke a record almost every week, and the kind of the scale of the industry in terms of the capacity we were adding on and what we were doing in terms of generation just kept going up and up. And I think there's probably a story somewhere about the regularity with which those records are being broken, actually, because it used to be a very rare event, and now it's pretty consistently through the winter that renewables are doing a large share of our generation.
Yeah, and indeed over the summer, clearly with a record, certainly in the UK, but and across Europe, in fact, a record sort of heat wave. Solar was able to smash some records also.
Yeah, exactly. And people talk a lot about the interseasonality of renewables and how we make sure we have system security. And certainly one of the things that I think is interesting is the way that wind and solar complement each other. And that's, so as you say, we've seen a year where we've had record-breaking solar in the summer, and we look set to be having a winter where we've got record-breaking wind. The missing silver bullet is storage, I think, and all kinds of storage, from storage that can do intra-hour and intra-day and an intra-seasonal. But yeah, it's the first flickers of a renewables-led system, and we enjoy that.
Yeah.
The office.
Yeah, for sure. As you said, there's a lot around that of storage, and we've seen huge leaps. If we perhaps move into innovation, we've seen huge leaps in terms of battery storage in particular, and obviously lithium ion as a primary source. Within that, still some work to go on longer duration flow batteries and the like. But again, some incredible successes. But this interseasonal stuff is a challenge. Hydrogen potentially playing a part. But any particular innovations, firstly, in terms of the broader storage topic that you see or expect to see or that are coming through from your members?
So significant. So I think we said at the beginning that we grew up out of being the wind, wave and tidal trade body. But that hasn't been true as a reflection of what our members do for, I'd say, nearly the last decade, because we've diversified into companies that are part of the supply chain, but also these days companies that are increasingly looking at offering business services or other technologies. And storage is a big one. So our utility member companies and our developer member companies are all looking at storage or EVs or decarbonisation of heat as well as power. And our supply chain members are developing technologies or in fact not technology companies, but people like blockchain companies or aggregators and so on. And that's leading to some new business models already. So we've got, for example, people looking at how you might do peer-to-peer trading or direct consumer purchasing of power from wind farms on one end. And on the other, we've got technological innovation like co-location, so batteries being located alongside wind farms, so they're offering a kind of firm power. And off the back of that, we're pretty confident that, for example, wind and storage could be bidding into things like the capacity market shortly. Were the rules to allow that, were we to be running the capacity market at the moment? So yeah, it's happening. It's not, I think people talk about disruption as if it's something that will happen as opposed to something that's already happening.
For sure, yeah, I think that's one of the challenges sometimes we have, and perhaps even within our audience, we clearly those that are in the sector and live it every day see tremendous innovation, both in terms of technology and business models. But the challenge, I guess, for all of us, and particularly as a trade body, is to sort of engage with the broader public. It must be a real challenge when you're talking to journalists or people outside of the sector to try and get that message across that this is not a future scenario. This is all happening as we speak.
It is, and it isn't. The last 2 years have really shifted because renewables have gone from being a kind of green outlier technology that we were developing to being the cheapest form of new generation that the UK has. And that has opened up a whole new audience of being able to have a conversation about the energy sector. So it's become more of an energy-led conversation than a climate change-led conversation. And so if you start on that footing, it's quite easy to engage people. And then the other thing that really works is a lot of people are interested in more decentralized distributed energy technologies because they feel so much more personal. So what we're seeing in electric vehicles, for example, is leading with some customers who have electric vehicles to conversations about load shifting and smart charging and decarbonized energy tariffs. And so I think all of that stuff that's happening on the demand side and all the technology change is also opening up a conversation about renewables too. Plus those records that we talked about, this idea that actually you can have a renewables-led system and the lights are going to stay on, turns out it has really...
Turns out we were right.
Yeah.
Okay, jumping back to...
I don't think it's dignified to do a told you so dance. And risky because we've still got a lot of change to go. But certainly it's nice at the moment.
It's very tempting at times. Jumping back to something you touched on then, and certainly for ourselves at Hyperion, we've done an awful lot of work in the last 18 months in regards to e-mobility, and clearly that's a sector which clearly does have a lot of hype, but is moving along quite substantially. Vehicle to grid as a storage medium. Now, again, I know that your role is a lot sort of policy related as much as technology related, but again, from your members, have you a feeling or a thought on sort of V2G and other interseasonal or sort of broader storage technologies and business models that will help to make this transition speed up?
Yeah, so as a policy analyst, I think that the electric vehicles, if they deploy at the speed that we think they will, and we'd be mad not to think that they will deploy fast, if not faster than we predict, because that's the way it's been with every other form of disruptive energy technology that consumers have. Things like solar PV went about 15 times faster than we thought it would.
Yeah.
So I think EVs will deploy very quickly. And if they do, there's a demand issue to be managed on the grid. And as a policy analyst, I also think there's a demand opportunity with kind of hundreds and thousands of tiny little batteries moving around. That's a very cold policy interpretation of what EVs could do and what people are likely to do with EVs. And if you look at some of the issues, for example, how do we get the right financial incentives in place and the right tariffs in place to nudge people to charge them when we want to charge them rather than when they want to charge them? How will other market entrants, people like retailers and so on, attract people to use their charging points? Is there a financial benefit from them to do it? How can we get them to charge over longer periods of time in unusual locations? How and who should roll out the charging infrastructure to enable all of that? And then we're also tracking things about all of those incentives also have to make it more attractive for people to be using their cars as batteries with the associated battery degradation rather than using their cars as vehicles. And that's all quite complicated stuff, and it involves behavioral economics as well as getting the right policy signals in place and just straightforward what the technology is capable of. But we have got members looking at all of those, and I was in a conversation yesterday where EDF, who are a member of ours, are looking at things like Vehicle to Go over in Oxford, a kind of demonstrator with domestic vehicles in the city and what they could be used for. And we also are really interested in Octopus Energy's agile experiments where they've nudged consumer behaviour using a tariff and EVs. So all of that's happening in the market.
Where do you see, from a policy perspective, I think time of use tariffs is something which clearly is a tool that can be hugely beneficial, I think. Do you see that might be something rolled out on a broader scale anytime soon?
I was about to say yes, and then anytime soon is an interesting so they're absolutely necessary for this world that we picture. They're, no question. And I mean, 7 years ago, we were talking about changing the balancing and settlement code to allow half-hourly settlement, and everyone thought that we were mad because we were at the time I was doing work on aggregation and demand-led grid services, demand-side grid services. I think we haven't really moved very far on from that debate, at least with the regulator. And we have now got the ability to settle a half hour, but I think we'll be looking for even smaller windows of time. The other piece there is actually smart meters that people are using will need to be in everyone's homes. And I think a certain amount of engagement and trust with a supplier, because some of this stuff will have to be automated for it to be really useful to the grid.
Yeah.
So it's not just about having flexible tariffs. It's again about how people adopt them and whether we can get people or incentivize people to use them in a way that's smart, not just for themselves, but also for the grid.
Yeah. Yeah. It's about control, isn't it? It's nice when you can, and again, having been in the sector for a while, where as a homeowner you can choose when to, switch the washing machine on when the solar panels are working, or something very simple like that. But when somebody else is making those controls, I guess that's, as you say, a behavioural and an acceptance issue that needs to be quite a bit of work on, I would suggest.
Exactly, and I think that most of the businesses that are doing that kind of thing, and there are businesses doing that kind of thing and consumers trialling that kind of thing, but to get it to scale, I think businesses are always saying that the regulator and government could move faster. And I think businesses always say that about government, but I think the speed of technology change it is going to catch government out. And for a long time, government has been a big driver for change in the energy sector. And now we're in a situation where actually the market and consumers buying new products and wanting new services will drive the shift in the market. And regulation will be the thing that gets left behind or is a barrier. And I really I think that's a huge intellectual challenge for people that work in policy that are used to being market setting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was interesting. I was at Utility Week in Vienna a few weeks back, and it was great to see how that had evolved. And almost everything there on show and being discussed in the forum was around digitisation of the energy system and those softer, I guess, rather than purely technological products or issues. These things are all happening so fast, and as you say, it's difficult for us within the sector to keep up with what's going on sometimes, let alone the regulators and governments who have other issues on their plates.
Yes, and it's why the incumbents are innovating too, because everyone in the sector can see that vertically integrated utility model of generation and supply aligned and a few big players and a centralised system is probably dead, or at least we'll have to hugely innovate. It's not going to be the dominant model in the system anymore by 2030, and probably even earlier. And everyone can see that what's happened in other sectors who face that big technology transformation is outside players have come in and taken the opportunity to run better services in the market, haven't had large companies or huge amounts of kit, but just come up with a better business model and kind of come in and stolen all the consumers and revolutionise the way we do things. And if you think about telecoms and what companies like WhatsApp did to the way that we all communicate, we're looking at something similar in the way that we all use energy. And I think most energy businesses know that, and most energy businesses are scrambling to move. I think governments, which have very timetabled ways of working, 8-week consultations and legislative changes that have to go through the House on a certain process, and all of that is right. It's the way that we do good governance, but it is now probably not moving at the pace with which the sector is moving, and particularly with which the innovators are moving.
Sure. Yeah. It's interesting talking about, sort of as part of that topic, the utility companies and how they're evolving and how some of these challenger businesses have evolved. I just noted recently, partly because of the demise of others, but sort of OVO now with over 1 million customers, and most of the sort of challenger players, and with Pure Planet, for example, most of these guys are sort of adding quite rapidly, and the likes of Centrica and others are sort of losing on a retail level. So again, these factors must all continue to drive the likes of the sort of the big incumbents to modify their business models as well.
Yeah, exactly. So it is a big news story from the last few weeks, but if you are in the energy sector, I don't think anyone was surprised that Scottish Power Renewables have chosen to go 100% renewables with their generation fleet in the UK, and divest of the last of their fossil fuel assets and make that a huge thing about their business. That is a really sensible move if you're looking at the way generation and business services are going in the energy sector. I think for maybe people who aren't in the sector, it was a really big surprising move. There's one of our big 6 utility companies is now 100% renewable, and that's the future they're backing. And I talked about EDF already, but similarly, Vattenfall, who are a major European utility, and over here a very large developer of wind, are looking at heat decarbonisation and transport and other business services. And you've already mentioned the fact that the market is now not just the big 6, it's other utility companies, and we've got Octopus and OVO and many others entering the sector and offering services, and yeah, it's interesting times for all of us, for sure.
Very good. Yeah, certainly I think the business model innovation is one of the critical factors, but clearly technology does evolve. One thing that pops up onto my timeline quite often is both floating solar and floating wind. Again, do you see, because again, UK wind in particular is, well, and solar, but UK wind in particular has been a massive success story. What sort of impact can and do you see floating wind have both in the UK and potentially in other markets where sort of the seas are perhaps deeper and traditional offshore wind isn't quite as easy to get away?
Like you say, COP24 is going on in Poland right now, and the pressure of global decarbonisation and also the opportunity to take advantage of low-cost renewables means that lots of other countries are looking to emulate what the UK power sector has done. However, most other countries, particularly for wind, don't have that even if they've got the wind speeds, don't have the shallow water that we've got to develop an offshore wind fleet as easily as we have. And then here in the UK, if you look out to sort of 50 gigawatts possibly of offshore wind here, it seems clear that we're going to have to build in deeper water.
Yeah.
And therefore that we are going to need another round of innovation on how we put up turbines. And floating offshore wind has been something that, along with wave and tidal technologies, actually, is something that every government with a coastline and an interest in renewables since I've been in this job has come to ask me about. So countries like Indonesia or South Korea or Australia, France, and Canada and others are all, and bits of America actually, are all interested in floating offshore wind. So that leads me to think that there are a couple of things for government to think about. Firstly, we should have learned our lessons from having invested in innovative technologies and got them to scale with onshore and offshore wind and solar. It worked. You know, that the investment that we've put in has delivered the cheapest form of generation we've got. And I think for offshore wind, the country's fourth largest infrastructure project. So why we're not doing that again with the next batch of innovative technologies that we know that we need is a bit beyond me. And there's currently no revenue mechanism for getting those kinds of technologies to scale. And I'm not just talking about floating wind or wave and tidal or floating solar. It's also things like storage, or I guess if you're the nukes guys, SMRs and other innovative technologies. It's probably the same in other sectors. We're just terrible at it as an economy. So there's that. We should learn our lessons and do it again for the UK government. And it's not just about domestic consumption, though I think we will and should be looking at floating wind in particular for our domestic generation needs in the 2030s and 40s. But it's a huge export opportunity.
Yeah.
And the businesses that I represent in the UK exported products and services to over 60 countries last year worldwide. And there is especially given the climate and Brexit and so on, there's a real opportunity to capitalise on the progress we've made in the UK with the power sector and export that knowledge and technology to other markets that are now doing this globally. I don't think we've really wrapped our heads around energy other than a kind of pounds per megawatt hour opportunity for UK consumers. We don't think about investing for reasons of regional GVA, and we certainly don't think about investing for export, but I think we need to think about all of those things.
Yeah, quite often disconnected. It seems when you look at the sort of the policy and governmental landscape, and clearly plenty of distractions in the UK, at least at the moment.
Yeah.
One thing also that we spoke of briefly before, and it's interesting, I got asked to write an article a week or so about the future of work, and indeed looking out to 2030, which was a challenge to say the least. But I know it's a topic that you have a great deal of interest to. Are there sort of particular areas or particular things that sort of are on your mind in terms of obviously AI and the sort of hours a week we work, and other sort of issues around how technology will and can impact, or for the better or for worse, in terms of the future of work?
Well, we were just talking about digitisation in the energy sector and kind of huge disruption. And what we've learned from other bits of the economy is that whilst that might be a good thing for the economy, it does change the way that we work and labour markets. So, fewer people, possibly fewer manufacturing jobs because you do more with less kit, all of that kind of thing. And I'm not talking about this as an immediate problem in the energy sector, but certainly in the long term, we know that a lot of the jobs that we think of as energy jobs don't exist yet.
Yeah.
Because they'll be part of this new market. I read that there's that, depending on which survey you read from which consultancy, anywhere between 60 and 85% of the jobs that today's school kids will be in don't exist yet. And the 85% figure, I think, comes from a World Economic Forum report.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So, go on.
I read one of the reports recently as part of this article writing, and that was quite moderate. 65% of the jobs that our kids will do don't yet exist. Which is,
exactly. But that's still huge, right? And how do you prepare the workforce for that? How do you how do you train and develop a workforce that is for jobs that don't exist, firstly, and how do you make sure that the UK can be a country that has those jobs in it so that they don't go elsewhere and other countries do it better? And the second thing about that is there's going to be a lot of change in the labour market, and in fact there already is, and my generation of graduates don't really expect to be in the same job for life. I think that's been true for some time, but also increasingly doing mentoring or careers events, I see people that are wanting to move every 2 years and don't see anything wrong with that. And the younger you kind of go down the workforce, the more that's true. So we've got this flexible, highly educated workforce coming through who will want and expect to change professions regularly, going into professions that don't exist yet. And I think as an employer, all of those things give me pause for thought. So there's a kind of wider macroeconomic picture. And then just on a personal level, this is an industry people want to work in, young people particularly. And there's you see news stories all of the time about graduates self-declaring that they won't go to work in the fossil fuels industry, or that they want to work on something to do with climate change and renewables. And anecdotally, that plays out with all the work that I do with graduates and students, that they're really passionate about possibly working in this industry. But they expect different things from the industry because they see us as a sector that's doing good. They expect us to look like that too. So I think we're going to come on to talk about it, but everything from diversity to flexible workplaces to humane working cultures and really good development and training and good labour standards, and all of that stuff really matters to them. And so I think we have to think about all of that and how we're embedding it in our organisations. Go on.
Yeah, it is a big challenge. I mean, clearly from a day job, as you know, I work with Hyperion Executive Search. We're a clean tech specialist search firm, and that one of the challenges we have, the market is growing phenomenally fast, and most of our clients come to us wanting a ready-made individual, and we've made a good reputation and good successes on doing exactly that. But for the good of the sector as a whole, clearly that's not a long-term possibility. And one of the things I think the clean sector has as an issue is how to adapt and how to bring people into the market who have transferable skills that can relatively quickly get up to speed. And then, as you say, the broader topics around the nature of work and millennials, or however you want, Gen Y, I think it is now, however you refer to these people coming into the jobs market, do want something different. And for a startup, that's quite cool because, again, you're typically quite a sort of often the founders and CEOs are younger and perhaps more in line with that way of thinking. Perhaps they've had a number of career opportunities themselves. But for some of the larger players for whom stability and sort of traditional working models is the norm, it really is a big challenge to face. And we also recognise that it's actually a competitive market because clean tech, of course, has an enormous future, and many things are happening. But thus in fintech and in pharma and in other sectors as well. And if we want to attract the best talent, we have to make sure that we are as welcoming on all levels as possible, including some of those that you touched on.
Yeah, it's about understanding that the sector is going to have a massive variety of people and skill sets. There are some, I should have noted that an immediate challenge is STEM and making sure that we've got people in STEM education, particularly women staying in STEM education, so that we've got the kind of skill set to do the engineering side of this and the technical side of this industry for sure, particularly in the UK. So the offshore wind sector deal is in negotiation with government at the moment, and they're making some really big commitments on skills and training because there is a risk of a skill shortage in the UK in the short term. And my favourite stat from all of the analysis that we've been working on with the offshore wind industry is that for STEM subjects at 16, it's about 50-50 girls and boys taking STEM subjects. And then when you get to A-level, it's something like 90-10 boys to girls. And then that immediately means that the workforce that you can get at the end of a graduate training course tends to be more men than women. And there's nothing wrong with that in theory. But when you think about what 23-year-old graduates expect, they expect a diverse workforce.
Yeah.
So we've got to shift it much earlier in education, and that's some of that is industry's job, but some of it is governments and how we talk to girls and boys about what the industry involves. But all of the things you've talked about also are about the skill sets we'll need as this industry changes, and many of them are going to come from other sectors, bits of the economy that are good at services and business propositions, bits of the economy that are good at digital and other kinds of technology, so telecoms and the Internet of Things guys and the tech giants are at risk of nicking our staff, but hopefully we can nick staff from them. And the most important thing above all is knowing that we want people that are going to be adaptable.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that sort of flexibility, which again is, I guess, more usual and more expected for the younger generations coming through. But the flexibility of work, both in the literal and the metaphorical sense, in terms of flexible working hours, but also in terms of, we know the industry moves very fast, and companies quite often have to pivot, or divisions have to pivot, or technologies change rapidly, and the ability to be flexible and to cope with that more, in some ways, chaotic environment is important.
Yeah, and I think we should give the for want of a better word, the older generation or the incumbents a clap on the back, because things have changed hugely in the last decade and they've all adapted to it so far. You think about we're powering on average a third of the UK's electricity mix now from renewables, and 15% of that comes from wind. Coming back to the start of this conversation, that huge technological and market shift has been brought about by engineers who've been working in this sector for decades, and you can see that eagerness to shift and change and grow, and I think that that's commendable in the existing industry. The idea that National Grid is separating in half so that they can think about how to best adapt to this current system is a real sign that even the incumbents and the really big engineering guys can change. So it's not just about millennials, it's about all of us. Go on.
I think jumping back to the STEM situation, I must confess, whilst it's one of those, if your mindset is that of being an egalitarian, you don't tend to think necessarily of things being any different. But it was first brought to our attention, Hyperion at least, with a great client, actually, Arenco. I don't know if you know Rupert Newland and Andy Hadland from Arenco, an energy storage developer. But they came to us with the project to recruit, in fact, a whole team for them. And diversity in all, it's not just in terms of gender, but diversity generally was a big topic. And when we really tried to make sure we went out to market to create the best opportunities for at least the opening of the talent pool to be as diverse as possible, it was a massive challenge. We were able to succeed to an extent. It's a situation we at Hyperion face ourselves in terms of trying to get a broader diversity of across the range. It's a challenge at all levels, I think, I should say, in terms of from a schooling level. The stats that you just mentioned, I think, are quite staggering, and whilst they're to some extent not surprising, they're also quite shocking. Yes,
and it's I'll come back to what we might do about diversity in the workplace, but on education, there are in some bits of the market there are more female engineers and technicians, and a lot of that comes from how the profession is understood. And so this is hugely anecdotal, so come at me on Twitter, but we meet there are a lot of disproportionately a lot of Spanish female engineers, and coming from, so Iberdrola, who's Scottish Power Renewables parent company, have lots of brilliant engineers who are women who I've met, and graduate trainees. And my understanding is some of that comes from the idea that engineering in Spain is considered a profession, like medicine is considered here. And medicine is one of the few STEM subjects where you've got equal numbers of men and women, if not actually, off the top of my head, maybe even more women doing well. And I think it's some of it is about just talking to women about what these jobs actually involve and removing ourselves from, I think, probably quite gendered stereotypes about what you can do with those qualifications. And I remember people coming and talking to me about what engineering would involve from my school days, and it being usually men who were coming to chat to us, but also quite, kind of overalls and oil.
Yeah. Dirty fingernails kind of stuff.
Yeah, tight images. And I'm not saying that women necessarily will be put off by that, but there is this kind of sense that it's something for boys still. And I think that's got to be cultural as well as it's educative somehow. And I'm not sure how we fix that, but I do know that where we've got it right, you do get more women coming forward. On what we do in business and your issue about finding the right candidates now, we've become a lot. So at Renewable UK, we set targets for our events. So we want to have 30% women speakers across on our stages and our platforms across our events. And we set those targets because the young graduates and our younger staff required them. So I think there are lots of different theories about how you might fix gender diversity in the workplace, and quotas I know is an uncomfortable thing for a lot of people to think about because they're quite a blunt tool and targets. But just the level of impatience from our young grads that things weren't changing and this being something they really wanted to see, and that they had no problem with quotas and targets, I thought was quite interesting, because that when I was starting my career, I was, I felt quite strongly about not having quotas and targets because I was just going to do it on merit, and they just, they're out of patience. That generation coming through.
I think that you made a very interesting point, actually. I think again, there's been not just in our sector, but broadly, a sort of this the manel kind of. I'm not quite sure you referred to as sort of a topic, at least, of discussion, and increasingly looking to making sure, and sort of big hoo-has where there is a purely male panel and quite often a purely white male panel.
Yeah.
I think just seeing people up there of a range of backgrounds is healthy. But again, I think that has certainly, from anecdotally at least, improved or made it easier to get across that within the sector there are people who are very capable and very intelligent and leading the way from a variety of backgrounds.
We know from the research that role modelling works. So there are two reasons to get diversity right in your organisation. And the first is about keeping and attracting your workforce. And we know that if you've got more diverse voices on stage and people can see themselves in the leaders in your business, that they're more likely to stay and become leaders in your business. And it really is that simple. So the trick is making sure that you're very clear that you're doing that, but it's not tokenism. All of the women we put on our stages are brilliant, and actually have improved events immeasurably. Because the second reason to do it is diversity of thought, and that comes in lots of shapes and forms. But people who've had different experiences growing up, who come from different sectors in our world, who represent different technologies or business models, and from different culture and gendered backgrounds, all tend to think about things in a different way. And we know from places like the Cranfield Institute and anyone that's looked at this, that more diverse boards and management teams lead to better commercial outcomes for companies.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of our clients are recognising that or have done, and are increasingly striving to make sure they do bring that diversity into their business. And it can be a struggle. So we certainly need to fix in the UK at least, fix the sort of the educational routes for people to come through. Jumping on your thing about Spain also, actually, and again, anecdotally, I don't have any hard evidence, but we have an office in Munich and we've worked in Germany for some time. But Germany is another country where certainly we come across and have far more diversity in terms of the workforce, particularly in terms of gender, but also actually quite often with ethnic diversity as well.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I tend to speak a lot about gender because that's been my lived experience, so I feel a bit more authentic on it. But it's really important that we're not just a white industry as well. And there are other countries that are doing it better. So and it's really important that we look at what they're doing and get it right, and try and change what we've got now. So things like, I mean, in your world, you must know about practices like name blind CVs when we're doing recruitment, or going to recruiters like you and asking for, a diverse talent pool to draw from. At management level and at board level, we will, when we're doing our board elections, we do ask our member companies to try to think about diversity when they're putting forward candidates. And then it's one of the things that we can use our co-opted board places to help ensure that we get on our board. And, there are tools available to us right now to make that change happen. And coming back to why, it's because the 23-year-olds that work for me really expect it, and I, as a not-for-profit working in the renewable sector, have to find ways to keep them in my company. So I think it's really important. I'm really lucky that I work on a senior management team and for a board that has given me the space to talk about working culture and what we want the industry to be like and feel like, as well as the technical side of the industry or the kind of policy challenges.
Yeah. I think we've touched on in a relatively short time, clearly a number of huge topics, and there's a lot to play out. Just if you'd be willing to share a little bit of how you came to be where you are and what you see as both from a personal and from a Renewable UK point of view, the sort of the big challenges and opportunities for the next year.
That's a big one. So this is genuinely true. David Attenborough has ruined or made my life, depending on your perspective, because I did my training contract as a graduate in the financial services, and I was doing some large scale renewables financing. I was a graduate, so I was helping do some large scale renewables financing there, but Frozen Planet came out when I was halfway through that training contract, and the last episode on climate change made me so angry. I thought, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. And I quit my job and I went to work for a brilliant energy startup consultancy called Acuity, who are based in Birmingham.
Yeah.
And I was part of the team there and helped grow the business there. And they largely worked on the demand side. So heat aggregation, smart grids, all kinds of micro generation and new business models. So we were looking at things like aggregating up, heat pumps and new business models even then. And this was almost a decade ago. And from there, I went to WWF and headed up their climate program in the run up to the COP21, worked on coal phase out, worked on decarbonisation across the economy and things like land use and food, so really broad, and then to Renewable UK. And I tell you all of that because I tend to think about the power sector not in isolation. So I'm really, really fascinated by wind turbines, which my husband loves at parties. I will tell you all day long about the power sector if I can. But I think what's about to happen is much more interesting, which is the collapse of the heat transport power vectors. So as we decarbonise other areas of the economy and new technology comes forward, how all of that will work together, the smart system and more consumer-led models. And most importantly of all, how we get to running markets and infrastructure that are both large scale, because we're going to have offshore wind on the system and nuclear on the system and maybe some gas on the system by 2030, but also manage to have really decentralized, flexible, dynamic markets with new technologies working, and doing both, not either or, I think is the big challenge. And lastly, I got into this job to work on climate change, really, and I think that the moves towards 1.5 degrees are going to mean we have to do all of that and do it faster. And the reason I do this job, and I'm really proud to do this job for Renewable UK, is that we are the success story for decarbonisation right now. And I'm really hoping that we can build from what we've achieved in the power sector and drive that through the rest of the economy and give ourselves every chance that we've got having a fully decarbonised economy on the timescales we need to.
Yeah, I think, again, the IPCC report recently with the sort of the 12-year headline and some of the other activities in the world are a whole new conversation, perhaps best not to err into. But as you say, there's certainly huge cause for hope and optimism that I see through the changes that we see in the energy system and the renewable system. And it's great that organisations like yours and others play a huge part in both pushing the technology agenda, but also the policy agenda. And hopefully that combination from all of us in the sector will help us to get somewhat closer to what we need to achieve and to keep to 1.5 and below, because I think that, from my experience, is overwhelmingly the reason that most people in this sector, and obviously earning a living out of it, is a I won't say byproduct necessarily, but it certainly isn't the key driver. And I think that's one of the beauties of working in the sector.
I absolutely agree with that. I think with a reason to hope, when frankly looking at some of the research, there are lots of reasons to be not cheerful. So yeah, I feel very lucky to do what I do and to work with the people that I work with. And as you say, the economic side of this is sometimes a byproduct, but actually it's the economic side of this and the market side of this that I think is really driving change. And just to finish on a small plea, the government's feelings on onshore wind and what that's done to policy in the UK is so mad relative to the contribution that onshore wind can make for both bill payers now and in particular for meeting the carbon budgets. And what's shifting that conversation with government is the idea that they've accidentally ruled out now the cheapest form of technology that we've got in the UK. So it's the economic motivator that may shift government to invest in the technology. And then in a marketplace, it's the market continuing to innovate and find market-based models to develop onshore wind that may see us continuing to build as we go forward into next year and beyond. And I think, therefore, that it used to be, coming back to the government being a driver, when we thought about climate change, it used to be governments that we needed to act, and we still need them to act. But the thing that I really love about my job is I can get out of bed in the morning and work with businesses that are going to try and change the world anyway.
Absolutely, yeah. Likewise, I think it's certainly the driver for me and us at Hyperion. So I think that's a great place to stop, and hopefully the driver for most people, hopefully the driver for most people listening in, that it's there is hope, and if we all do the best that we can, then we have a fighting chance. So thank you very much for your contribution, Emma. It's great to talk to you.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
And there you have it, Emma Pinchbeck there talking to our host David Hunt. We hope you enjoyed this instalment of the This Week in Clean Tech podcast. If you enjoyed, please do leave a review on iTunes, as it really does help us out. And also feel free to subscribe on iTunes or, as always, the other usual platforms. Like I say, I hope you enjoyed this episode, and please do join us same time, same place next week for some more leading industry insights. Goodbye.